You're listening to a CNA podcast.
Now, if you are of a certain vintage, a bit like mine, you probably remember an American TV series called Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. Okay, if you're much younger, today's equivalent would be something like Bling Empire. Simply put, they're both shows about money, money, money. And since news broke on one of the biggest money laundering operations in Singapore, it seemed like those images of opulent wealth had come to life right here on our tiny island. We're talking wads of cash, just about $14 million. Add to that 50 vehicles, 105 properties, hundreds of high-end watches, luxury bags, and even bears. Yup, seems these bear bricks are very expensive. Hundreds of thousands of dollars each, actually. So that definitely blew our minds. Now, the 10 suspects arrested were all foreigners who hailed from Fujian province in China, but they carried passports from all over the world. Today, we want to peel back the curtains and ask, why is it so difficult to catch people like this? Today, we're recording online, and joining me are Adam Maniam, Director Dispute Resolution at Drew and Napier.
Hi, everyone.
Associate Professor Soh Kee Hean from the Singapore University of Social Sciences and a former director of the CPIB.
Hello, everybody.
Fabrizio Fioroni, Advisor, Anti-Money Laundering, Counter-Financing of Terrorism from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime.
Hello, Stephen. Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me today.
Gentlemen, welcome. Let me start by asking, how common are billion-dollar money laundering cases in the world? Fabrizio.
Yeah, let's say that billion-dollar cases are not so common. We do see some cases happening all around the globe. But I have to say, in this kind of magnitude is quite rare. That's because there are some complexities and difficulties which are embedded with preventing and investigating money laundering. So having that kind of result like this one, the recent one in Singapore, is quite astonishing.
So it sounds like $1 million transactions, not so unusual, but when it hits the $1 billion, then maybe a bit more so. Prof, so there's no secret that Singapore is business friendly. We try to keep our taxes low. We have many attractive incentives to attract the wealthy to come from all over the world. So every day there's actually lots of money flowing through our shores. But that's what we want, right?
Well, as you know, Singapore is a major financial hub. So every day there are many financial transactions that come in and out of our shores. It's a question of due diligence that needs to be performed by our financial institutions and those who manage the various financial transactions. With a huge volume of transactions, it is not an easy feat. And in fact, it is a big challenge to try to identify if there were illegal transactions or transactions that may be associated with money laundering. Very often, it is like looking for a needle in the haystack. But it really calls upon the agencies, the institutions, and all involved to do due diligence.
So, Adam, the Monetary Authority of Singapore has pretty strict anti-corruption and anti-money laundering laws. In fact, they've also set up new rules for family offices because increasingly we have those here in Singapore. The banks also have very strict scrutiny. So, why are criminals still able to evade these?
One of the key issues when it comes to money laundering is that the activities are decentralized. So you have a certain sum of money that people may want to launder, but they're not going to put in $1 billion at a time. They're going to spread it out amongst many different players. They're going to go to many different jurisdictions. They're going to use different means to get the funds where they want the funds to be. They could use some cryptocurrency, trading exchanges. They could put deposits in a certain country, get that deposit collateralized, get a loan, and move the amounts from the loan to another country. So that's one of the key problems. It's decentralized. There are many different players involved. So even if a bank, a particular financial institution, does their homework, does their KYC checks and thinks, okay, this is okay, on the face of it, that one transaction may be fine. But if you combine it with another 30 or 40 transactions, that's where the problem comes in, and that's where the difficulty comes in trying to enforce and trying to prevent these things from happening.
So in that sense, actually, the individual transaction is fully legitimate. It's abided by all the rules. It's come in a proper and legal way. But when you combine it with all the other things they are doing, then that raises suspicion. Is that what you're saying?
Even if the transaction is not legitimate, on the face of it, there may not be enough red flags to trigger a bank or a regulated entity from saying, there's something wrong here. I should raise this to the authorities because
Okay.
the ID checks out, the purpose checks out, and everything seems fine. But actually, when you take this together with another 30 or 40 transactions, that's where the problem is.
And that's the intent, right? To fly under the radar and be as inconspicuous as possible, I guess. Fabrizio, from what you've seen, is this quite common in how they operate?
Yeah, Adam made very good points. And also, if you look at the history of the fight against money laundering, we go back at the end of the 80s when there was this massive issue of the drug cartels in Latin America producing and distributing vast amount of drugs, and at the same time also injecting illegal money into the financial system. And at that time, the United Nations came out with the first UN convention that actually mentioned the fight against money laundering, because there has been an understanding that there was a need to address also the protection for the financial system, because there was this a lot amount of money that was polluting the legitimate economy with very serious consequences. We are talking about many years ago, and now obviously there has been an evolution of all the concept, because money laundering is not just about drugs trafficking, and we know that there are so many associated other type of crimes that can generate illegal money. And also the measures, the responses of the private sector and the public sector, the criminal justice system has gone through a parallel evolution. So there is this continuous chasing one after the other one, because where you have regulators in the private sector putting in place very solid, robust measures, you still have some kind of criminal organizations which manage to go through all these processes because they're very resilient. They quickly adapt. If you look at crime as a feature of society, probably the professor here can make better references, but you can see that crime usually adapt very well to new challenges as well. We had a good example from COVID where we saw new forms of criminals
Right.
coming out. So obviously, it's a continuous situation where the criminals and the authorities keep evolving.
It's a bit of a rat race, so to speak. You're trying to see who can stay ahead. And unfortunately, criminals tend to really think out of the box and find ways to milk the system to their advantage. Prof. Soh, when you were at the CPIB, Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, did you find that was the challenge, trying to sort of keep up with what the bad actors were up to?
Certainly, this is an ongoing challenge for law enforcement agencies and for governmental authorities. The challenge is compounded because those who want to engage in money laundering will keep on devise new and creative ways of doing it. For the law enforcement agencies, it's just trying to keep up and trying to figure out and trying to unmask the different methods that have been used. And one challenge that needs to be addressed is that while we talk about money trail and the trail of the criminal proceeds, that needs to correspond and to tie up with the bad actors, the persons who are involved. You also need to look at their movement, their activities, and their interaction patterns. And it is a combination of understanding the money movement as well as the person movement that you then get a complete picture. And
Right.
that is, of course, extremely difficult and challenging.
Yeah, so in a way, you're almost saying to profile the person to understand whether this guy is actually a legitimate businessman or a dubious criminal, which can be quite hard to differentiate the two. So, in some cases, when the suspects are caught, they're also found to be holding citizenships from other countries that they were not born in, or even holding resident passes, employment passes, allowing them to stay and work legitimately in those countries. Is this common, Adam? Is it easy to just pick up a citizenship or an employment pass from certain countries?
It's more common than you would think coming from Singapore. It's not easy to get a PR or citizenship here, but in a number of cases, we have seen people being able to procure passports from other jurisdictions, and that certainly does help them if they want to engage in any illicit activity.
Does it raise any red flags? Can we tell if there has been citizenship by investment?
From my understanding, some countries allow that. It's not illegal. If you bring in a certain amount of funds to a certain country, then you could get citizenship within a rather short period of time.
Right.
So if someone is looking at a particular transaction and there is a dual citizenship, on the face of it, the person involved may not really have anything to do with the second country, then that might be a possible indicator that the entity involved should be doing a bit more checks to ensure
Okay.
that the transaction is above board.
Fabrizio, what do you think? How difficult is that?
It is difficult probably to stop because it's a legitimate process. Some jurisdictions, they don't have much financial resources, so they rely also on this kind of investment. So they attract foreign investment also in this way that can be used in a legitimate way. But the problem is that criminals try the ways to misuse this system. And then it's once again difficult to discriminate between who is doing legitimate activities or who is actually misusing this system again for committing criminal offenses.
And when you look at it from the United Nations point of view, do countries or agencies like Interpol also share information of this to sort of keep track on certain individuals who might be a bit more suspicious?
Yes, there are systems in place, and the Interpol channel is a good channel. They share information about identities, and when the interested country who is looking for a wanted person is actually get the knowledge that the same person has acquired a new citizenship with a new passport, and most likely with a kind of new identity, because sometimes the translation of names gives the opportunity to give a new identity. In that case, they do share information also through the Interpol channel. And there have been successful cases where suspects have been arrested while traveling using these new identities.
My understanding is that I'm sure if you were wanted in one country, you might try and move to another country and live there under perhaps even a different name. And it could be quite hard to know whether that person, because you can't tell what's happened in the other country.
Yeah, it is difficult anyway. It is difficult.
Criminals also tend to put their money into physical assets, property, homes, cars, luxury items. Perhaps, Adam, you can shed a bit of light because, for example, here in Singapore, where we know the property market is quite tight, so when someone starts picking up lots of property, should that also be another red flag? Sort of property agents duty bound to also raise those red flags?
Currently, property agents are actually required to do some level of checks. So they have to check identification, that the person you're dealing with is the person whom they say they are. They don't really need to inquire as to the purpose of the transaction at this point in time. But I think you raise a good point. If someone is amassing a large number of properties and there doesn't seem to be any ostensible reason for them to be doing so, then that could be an indicator. Insofar as people have done this in Singapore, they are quite careful that it's not the same person buying the properties. It's all, as I mentioned earlier, quite decentralized, so that on the face of it, the person that you're dealing with doesn't really seem to be doing anything that's amiss, but it's taken in conjunction with other things that the concerns arise.
And I imagine they may even use different property agents, different property companies, just to, again, keep each transaction quite individual. So how then will we sort of try and keep track of these people? At which point does it become an issue? Because a rich individual buying 3 or 4 properties may not really raise any alarm bells, but I guess once you cross 5, 6, how do we sort of measure that? Prof. Soh, what do you think?
It's a question of what red flags can be identified with some of these transactions. For example, if someone comes around to buy luxurious property, some of the behavior may be a little bit out of the ordinary. For example, they do not even look at the property, or they don't really negotiate the buying price, or they are
Okay.
not willing to indicate some information that the property agent may have asked for. So some red flags may have to be picked up, and that may tell us something is amiss. But if it is multiple property transactions, and if it's spread out among different property agents, different buyers, and they may also engage different conveyancing lawyers so as to not draw much attention to it, then it only means that people who have to watch over this, such as the regulators
Right.
or maybe the at the property company level, some amount of monitoring and data analytics may be helpful.
Yeah, that's kind of like saying if this same individual buys 5 properties, that should ding, raise an alarm, and I should be curious to find out more. But then again, as a property agent or a property company, you just want to make that money, right? So how can we force these people to raise an alarm, which may then be false, and then they may lose a potential customer, so to speak? Is there a concern there as well?
Of course, the law imposes the requirement on property agents and various other professionals to lodge suspicious transaction report. But you're right, if this goes to the nub of the issue that they are doing a business, surely they don't want to lose a big customer. But nonetheless, it is an obligation on their part. They should carefully evaluate because if they just close an eye and just merrily transact the property, they may be facilitating money laundering. And if they are not found out today, they could be found out tomorrow, a month later, and then they'll face legal consequences.
Because that is a criminal offense, right?
Yes, that's right.
Fabrizio, I mean, you've heard all this discussion as well, and it sounds like these are really tough waters to navigate. So how can countries and authorities better deal with it? Is this something that needs to be a global, regional kind of thing?
It's a global problem. Obviously, when you deal with money launderers or transnational crime in general, you have to look at international interconnections which are put in place by these kind of subjects. To improve the situation, obviously, there is a need first for having proper solid legislation in place and regulations. Then there is a need for really strong political will to address the issue of money laundering, because you need to have proper resources assigned to those who are supposed to regulate and enforce the legislation against money laundering. And then you have the need for the private sector in general to understand the risks that they are exposed to when they deal with their customers. Putting all together, it's quite encouraging now also in Singapore to see that there are very good initiatives in facilitating the discussions between the private and public sectors. So they share information much easier way compared to a few years ago, because we have different kind of skills and knowledge which are in use in the private sector. We have very skilled now bank officers who are very capable of understanding the risks they are exposed. In many situations, we see bank officers who seems to act really like investigators, much more than law enforcement in some countries. On the other side, you have law enforcement investigators who have access to more information regarding possible criminal activities, that they can combine this kind of information in an easier way and then fight properly.
Hello, my name is Steve Lai.
And I'm Teresa Tang, and we are the hosts of CNA Correspondent,
A podcast that takes you to the heart of the work our correspondents do across the globe.
from China's COVID response to the childcare center massacre in Thailand.
And from the fall of Najib Razak to the rise of Anwar Ibrahim as Malaysia's Prime Minister.
We speak to the people at the reporting front lines.
So if you want to know how the biggest global stories unfold, make sure you follow or subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts.
So, Adam, would it help if there were more stricter regulations in a country here like Singapore? Would that help prevent such things from happening? Because, again, we want to attract business here, so it's kind of a fine line. How do you balance both of them?
So I don't think that stricter regulations are necessarily the answer. Currently, there is an act in place which requires banks, etc., to file suspicious transaction reports if they suspect that they are dealing with proceeds of criminal conduct. And the threshold is quite low. It just requires the person involved to have a reasonable suspicion or knowledge that what they're dealing with could be the proceeds of criminal conduct. So I think the solution really is to have more cooperation and communication between different agencies. And I think this is something the Monetary Authority of Singapore has realized, because they've essentially found that, well, the banks by themselves, they are filing the STRs, the suspicious transaction reports, when they need to. But sometimes they don't realize that there could be potential issues because there's a lack of communication between the banks. There's been recent intended amendments to legislation, and the MAS is intending to come up with something known as cosmic or the collaborative sharing of money laundering, terrorist financing information and cases. So this is essentially a platform where banks can communicate with each other, and if they suspect unusual activity on the part of one of their customers, then they may be able to share information, and it may help to raise more awareness. It may help to identify cases that previously, right now, they won't be able to identify as being potentially problematic cases.
Because otherwise you're saying Bank A may be suspicious of a certain customer, but Bank B won't know about it. And I guess because of privacy issues, they wouldn't share that kind of information as well, right? So
exactly. The transaction by itself might pass muster. They might have a question mark about something, but maybe in conjunction with information from Bank B and Bank C, then they might say, oh, yeah, actually there's a problem. Whereas by themselves, they might say, we tick all the boxes, we are okay. We don't need to file an STR.
Especially if the guy is banking with bank A, B, C, D, E.
Yeah.
With larger sums of money, then you know, okay, something's wrong.
Yeah.
Can technology help? Fabrizio, what do you think? Will AI change the game? Can it help catch these guys?
Yeah, going back to the initial introduction I made, obviously it's going to help both criminals and whomever is chasing them, because we see opportunities anytime raising up also for the bad actors. But obviously now the regulators and the private sector should see how new technologies like artificial intelligence can actually help in facilitating finding out whomever is actually hiding their criminal activities throughout the thousands of transactions who are being registered every day.
Prof. So how should we approach this? If you had something you could change moving forward, what do you think would be an effective way to help prevent money laundering from hitting our shores?
One of the important elements is international cooperation, because much of the money laundering that we see has an international character. It involves not just Singapore but other jurisdictions. So it will not be effective if we only look at what we have and improve only what we have, because it is necessary to get the other countries on board. Money flows from country to country at a very rapid pace, and it is necessary that countries are able to react. It would not help if countries seek assistance from each other and then the response doesn't come, or the response takes a very long while. And we're looking at not just the money trail that crosses borders, but also the bad actors, as we mentioned earlier, the movement of the people who are involved across borders, and information sharing about the persons of interest. You know, you may need information of what they have done. You may need background information on persons, companies, and so on. In order for various countries to successfully fight money laundering, we do need to see much more effective international cooperation.
It does sound like you almost want a list of some of the suspected bad actors from around the world. That's something that every country has access to, so that they can better keep an eye on their own shores as well. Adam, last thoughts on this also, in terms of how can we move forward?
As echoed by my co-speakers, collaboration and cooperation will be key. Technology will help, but the reality is that the regulators will always be one step behind, because when a new technology comes up, there needs to be time for legislation to be put in place. The criminals will always be faster. And so I think what we need is cooperation, and we also need legislation in place that encourages the cooperation and also gives the flexibility to the regulators and the authorities to do what they need to do to stop these kinds of activities.
This is one battle that doesn't sound like it's ending anytime soon. Well, gentlemen, thank you for coming and sharing your insights on this issue. It really is a larger scheme of things, and these $1 billion floating around in different countries, coming into the shores in different ways, is something that is very distant for the average person living in a country, the average Singaporean here. But we all want to make sure that we try and keep our countries as clean and safe as possible from any kind of criminal activities. After all, that's also what keeps our reputation alive as a country and as an economy. So thank you all for listening. Do leave a comment if you've been listening to our podcast and you like what you hear. Just jump onto Spotify and Apple and give us a good review, hopefully. The team behind this podcast is Jacqueline Chan, Joanne Chan, Saya Win, Tiffany Ang, Jocelyn Tan, and Crispina Robert. And I'm Stephen Chia, signing off. Bye for now.